Bennett Grayson had always been proud of the home he'd built for himself. Nestled at the edge of a quiet suburban community, his property stood apart literally and figuratively. A long gravel driveway wound through a cluster of oak trees, creating a sense of seclusion that Bennett cherished. The driveway wasn't just an access point to his house, it was a symbolic line that separated his personal space from the rest of the world. As a landscape designer, he had poured his expertise into every inch of his property, ensuring it was both functional and visually stunning. He enjoyed the privacy it afforded him, and the thought that this space was entirely his gave him a sense of peace in an otherwise chaotic world. It was a cool Thursday evening when Bennett noticed something odd. He had just returned from a meeting with a client, his truck rumbling up the gravel driveway under the glow of his headlights. As he approached the final stretch leading to his home, his eyes caught the faint glint of metal a row of cars parked along the edge of his driveway. His immediate thought was that someone must have mistaken the property for a public space. That thought quickly soured as he drove closer and saw the vehicles weren't just parked haphazardly, they were lined up neatly, as though deliberately arranged. Bennett stepped out of his truck, his boots crunching on the gravel. His initial confusion gave way to irritation as he noticed the license plates on the cars bore the familiar numbers of local residents. These weren't strangers passing through, they were his neighbors. One car's driver, a man Bennett vaguely recognized from down the street, was leaning casually against his sedan, scrolling through his phone. When Bennett approached, the man didn't even look up. "Hey," Bennett called out, his tone firm but not aggressive. "What's going on here?" The man glanced up lazily, then gestured toward a hand-drawn sign staked into the ground nearby. Bennett followed the motion and squinted to read the words scrawled in thick marker: "Temporary parking for community event." "Community event," Bennett repeated, his voice sharpening. "This is private property." The man shrugged. "They said we could park here. It's for the block party." Bennett asked, though he already had a sinking suspicion about the answer. "Yeah, the neighborhood president," the man said with a vague wave of his hand, already turning back to his phone. Bennett's frustration flared. He didn't attend the neighborhood meetings, nor did he participate in the so-called community events. He wasn't even a member of the local council or any of their committees. His property had always been his own, and he'd made it clear from the day he moved in that he wasn't interested in their oversight or rules. Yet here he was, with his driveway turned into an impromptu parking lot for an event he hadn't been informed of, much less agreed to. For a moment, Bennett considered arguing further, but he could see it was pointless. This man wasn't the one to blame. Shaking his head, he walked toward his house, resolving to deal with it in the morning. The next day, Bennett woke up early, still stewing over the previous evening's events. Determined to set the record straight, he began drafting an email to the neighborhood president, Lynn Rawlings. Lynn was known for her overbearing attitude and relentless involvement in everyone's business. She had a knack for making decisions on behalf of the neighborhood without consulting those affected, always claiming it was for the greater good. Before he could finish the email, a knock at the door interrupted him. Bennett frowned as he set his laptop aside and made his way to the front door. Standing on his porch was Lynn herself, clipboard in hand and a too-wide smile plastered across her face. Her crisp blazer and perfectly styled hair screamed authority, though Bennett always thought her demeanor leaned more toward condescension than professionalism. "Good morning, Bennett," Lynn chirped, her voice carrying the grating cheerfulness of someone who knew they were about to deliver bad news but relished it anyway. "Morning," Bennett replied curtly, crossing his arms. "Something I can help you with?" Lynn's smile didn't falter. Instead, she held up her clipboard, flipping through a few pages before handing him one. "I wanted to personally deliver this notice. It's about the driveway." Bennett took the paper and scanned it, his irritation quickly boiling into disbelief. The document was an official-looking notice, stamped with the neighborhood association's logo, stating that his driveway was now classified as a public access road. Effective immediately, it would be open for communal use during neighborhood events and other approved activities. "This is a joke, right?" Bennett asked, looking up at her. "Not at all," Lynn said brightly. "The neighborhood council voted on it during last week's meeting. Didn't you get the agenda? It was sent out to all residents. I didn't attend the meeting, Bennett said, his voice hardening, and I don't recall ever agreeing to this. This driveway is private property. I built it with my own money. Lynn's smile tightened slightly, though her tone remained maddeningly pleasant. Oh, I understand your concerns, Bennett, but the council reviewed the situation and determined that your driveway's location makes it ideal for community use. It's a central access point, and with all the growth in our neighborhood, we need to start thinking about shared spaces. It's for the greater good, you see. The greater good, Bennett repeated, his voice rising. You're telling me you can just decide to turn my private property into a public road without my consent? Lynn held up a placating hand. It's not quite that simple. The council has the authority to designate certain areas for community benefit if they meet specific criteria. And as you know, your property falls within the boundaries of our jurisdiction. Bennett stared at her, his mind racing. He'd never signed anything agreeing to be part of their association or its jurisdiction. In fact, he'd gone out of his way to avoid entanglements with them when he purchased the property. I think you need to leave, Bennett said, his tone cold. And you can tell your counsel that this isn't over. Lynn's smile finally faltered, but only for a moment. Of course, Bennett, take all the time you need to review the notice. But I would advise you to consider working with us. It'll be much easier that way. As she turned and walked back toward her car, Bennett crumpled the notice in his hand. Easier for who? He wasn't about to let this go. This was his land, his driveway, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it away from him. Bennett Grayson couldn't shake the anger from his encounter with Lynn Rawlings. Her smug smile and condescending tone echoed in his head as he paced his living room, clutching the crumpled notice in his hand. The audacity of the council to claim his private driveway as a public road without even consulting him, it was beyond insulting, it was infuriating. This wasn't just a violation of his property rights, it felt personal, a deliberate encroachment on the life he had built away from their meddling rules and oversight. He knew he needed to act quickly. Bennett's first call was to his lawyer, an old college friend named Rick Carlson, who had handled the purchase of the property when Bennett first bought it. Rick listened patiently as Bennett vented his frustrations, interjecting only to ask clarifying questions. They can't just declare your driveway public, Rick finally said, his tone calm but firm. Even if they have jurisdiction over the neighborhood, property laws clear your land is your land. Did you ever sign any agreements with the neighborhood council or association when you bought the property? Never, Bennett replied. I made sure of it. That was the whole point of buying this place. I wanted nothing to do with their rules or their so-called community projects. Rick hummed thoughtfully on the other end of the line. Good. That simplifies things. I'll need to look over your deed and any related documents to confirm. But if what you're saying is accurate, they don't have a leg to stand on. In the meantime, I'd suggest sending them a formal response to make it clear you're contesting this decision. Already on it, Bennett said, glancing at his laptop. I started drafting something last night. Good. Keep it professional, but firm. And don't engage with them directly. Let me handle any further communication. We don't want them twisting your words or using anything against you. Bennett agreed, feeling a bit calmer now that he had Rick in his corner. After hanging up, he spent the next few hours organizing his property documents, meticulously checking every detail to ensure there was no loophole they could exploit. By midday, he felt a little more confident. The council's claim was ridiculous, and he had the proof to back it up. But just as he was about to email Rick the scanned copies of his documents, a loud rumbling noise outside drew his attention. Bennett stepped onto his porch and immediately felt his stomach drop. A line of construction trucks was rolling down his driveway, kicking up clouds of dust as they came to a stop near the bend. Men in reflective vests and hard hats began spilling out, carrying tools and equipment. What the hell is this? Bennett shouted, jogging toward the nearest worker. The man barely glanced at him. Council-approved roadwork, he said curtly. We're here to begin the preliminary survey and prep the site. Prep the site for what? Bennett demanded. For upgrades, the man replied, clearly uninterested in explaining further. Bennett's fists clenched at his sides. This is private property. You can't just show up here and start tearing things up without my permission. The man sighed, finally turning to face Bennett. Look, buddy, we're just following orders. If you've got a problem, take it up with the council. We've got the permits right here. He gestured toward a clipboard held by another worker. Bennett stormed over and snatched the clipboard, scanning the document. Sure enough, it was stamped with the council's logo and signed by Lynn Rawlings herself. The document claimed that the road had been reclassified, and that the construction was necessary to bring it up to public safety standards. This is bullshit, Bennett muttered under his breath. He tried calling Rick, but it went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, he turned his attention back to the workers who were already unloading equipment. I'm telling you, this is private property, he said, his voice louder now. If you start digging up my driveway, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. The workers exchanged uneasy glances, but before they could respond, a familiar voice rang out behind him. Bennett. He turned to see Lynn Rawlings stepping out of a sleek black SUV, her ever-present clipboard tucked under one arm. She was flanked by two other council members, both wearing the same smug expressions that made Bennett's blood boil. Lynn, Bennett said coldly. What the hell is going on here? Language, Bennett, she chided, her tone dripping with faux politeness. There's no need for hostility. We're simply beginning the necessary upgrades to your driveway to ensure it meets public safety standards. My driveway is private property, Bennett snapped. You don't have the right to do this. Lynn's smile widened, as if she had been waiting for this argument. Actually, Bennett, as I mentioned yesterday, the council voted to reclassify your driveway as a public access road. This work is entirely legal and within our jurisdiction. Bennett shook his head in disbelief. You can't just reclassify someone's property without their consent. Oh, but we can, Lynn said, her voice oozing condescension. It's all in the bylaws. Section 14, subsection 3. I suggest you familiarize yourself with it. Bennett's jaw tightened. He knew this was a power play, a deliberate attempt to bully him into submission. I'm warning you, Lynn, if you don't stop this right now, I'll take legal action. Lynn's smile didn't waver. You're free to pursue whatever legal avenues you wish, Bennett. But I should warn you, these things can get expensive and time-consuming. With that, she turned on her heel and walked back to her SUV, leaving Bennett standing there seething. The workers resumed unloading their equipment, clearly emboldened by her presence. Bennett knew he needed to act fast. He snapped a few photos of the trucks and workers as evidence, then rushed back into his house to call Rick again. This time Rick picked up. They're here, Bennett said, his voice shaking with anger. Construction crews right on my driveway. They've got some bullshit permit from the council, signed by Lynn. Rick cursed under his breath. All right, don't panic. I'll draft an injunction to halt the construction. But it's going to take a day or two to get it filed. In the meantime, don't let them destroy anything permanent. Too late for that, Bennett muttered. Through the window, he could see workers marking the gravel with spray paint, preparing to dig. Listen to me, Bennett, Rick said firmly. Do not confront them directly. Document everything. Photos, videos, timestamps. We'll need all of it for the injunction. Bennett took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. Got it. I'll send you everything tonight. As he hung up, Bennett felt a surge of helplessness. This wasn't just a fight over his driveway anymore. It was a fight for his rights, his home, and his sense of control. Lynn and the council had made a grave mistake if they thought he would roll over and let them take what was his. Determined, Bennett grabbed his camera and headed back outside, ready to document every single move they made. This was far from over. Bennett Grayson didn't sleep much that night. He spent hours combing through his property records, his purchase agreement, and the deed to his land, scanning for any potential loophole Lynn Rawlings and her council could exploit. Each document reaffirmed what he already knew: the driveway was unequivocally his, bought and paid for, and there was no legal basis for the council's claim. Yet the sight of construction crews desecrating his private property earlier that day gnawed at him, and their smug confidence left him unsettled. He knew Lynn wasn't bluffing. She must have had some plan in place, even if it wasn't entirely legal. By morning, Bennett was fueled by frustration and a growing resolve to push back. After sending Rick Carlson all the photos and videos he had taken of the construction crew's activities, Bennett decided to take matters a step further. He drove to the local municipal office to confront the issue head-on. If the council had filed any paperwork claiming his driveway, he needed to see it for himself. The clerk at the front desk, a polite but overworked woman in her 50s, looked mildly surprised when Bennett mentioned the council's reclassification of his driveway. She tapped away at her computer, scrolling through records, before printing out a copy of the relevant filing. "This is what they submitted," she said, handing him the document. Bennett scanned the paper, his eyes narrowing as he read the details. The filing claimed that the driveway had been constructed partially on communal land and therefore qualified as an access road for the neighborhood. It even cited an old map of the area, which allegedly showed the driveway crossing into a section of land owned collectively by the council. "This is nonsense," Bennett muttered, holding the paper up. "The land has always been mine. I had a survey done when I bought the property. There's no communal land anywhere near my driveway." The clerk shrugged sympathetically. "You'll probably need to provide that survey as evidence. Sometimes these filings are based on outdated or inaccurate records." Bennett frowned, already texting Rick to let him know what he'd found. As he was leaving the office, a thought struck him. The filing's language seemed deliberately vague, as though it was written to create confusion rather than clarity. Someone was playing a bureaucratic game, counting on him not to have the resources or patience to fight back. When he returned home, Bennett found fresh evidence of the council's overreach waiting for him. A new sign had been planted at the entrance to his driveway, this time professionally made and bolted into the ground. It read "Public Access Road, Authorized Vehicles Only." Beside it, an orange traffic cone blocked part of the driveway, as if to further emphasize the council's claim. Bennett's jaw tightened as he ripped the sign from the ground and tossed it onto the gravel. He wasn't going to let them plant their flag on his land, not without a fight. He spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing the survey of his property with Rick over the phone. The survey clearly showed the driveway was entirely within his boundaries, with no overlap into communal land. Rick suggested hiring a licensed surveyor to conduct a fresh assessment, just to bolster their case in court. "I'll make a few calls," Rick said. "In the meantime, don't engage with the council directly. Let me handle them." Bennett agreed, but deep down he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Lynn wasn't the type to back off quietly, and her actions so far had only made that abundantly clear. Sure enough, the following morning brought more trouble. As Bennett sipped his coffee on the porch, he heard the now familiar rumble of truck engines. Another construction crew was pulling onto his driveway, this time with even heavier machinery. Workers began unloading a backhoe and stacks of asphalt, ignoring Bennett's presence entirely as they prepared to start paving. Bennett didn't bother confronting them directly. Instead, he marched back into the house, grabbed his phone, and began filming everything from his porch. He narrated the scene as he recorded, describing the equipment and the actions of the workers, ensuring there would be no ambiguity about what was happening. Before long, a shiny black SUV pulled up behind the trucks, and Lynn Rawlings stepped out, clipboard in hand and her usual smug expression firmly in place. Bennett turned his camera toward her as she approached, her heels clicking against the gravel. "Good morning, Bennett," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I see you're documenting our progress. That's smart. Transparency is important in these matters." "Transparency," Bennett repeated, lowering his phone slightly. "What you're doing is illegal, Lynn. You're trespassing on private property, and you know it." Lynn sighed theatrically, as if she were dealing with a petulant child. "Bennett, we've been through this. The council has the authority to manage communal resources for the benefit of the neighborhood. Your driveway falls under that jurisdiction now, whether you like it or not." "My driveway isn't communal, and you know it," Bennett shot back. "I have the deed, the survey, and every piece of documentation to prove it." "What do you have?" "A fraudulent filing and some made-up bylaws." Lynn's smile didn't waver, though a flicker of irritation crossed her face. "I suggest you consult your lawyer before making such accusations. We've been very patient with you, Bennett, but our work can't be delayed any longer. The community is counting on this." She gestured toward the workers, who were now unloading massive rolls of asphalt material. "Count on this," Bennett muttered under his breath, raising his phone again to capture the scene. For a moment, Lynn's facade slipped, and she took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You really should think about cooperating, Bennett. Fighting us will only make things harder for you in the long run." "Is that a threat?" Bennett asked, meeting her gaze. "Not at all," Lynn said smoothly, her smile returning. "Just friendly advice." With that, she turned and walked back to her SUV, leaving Bennett seething. That evening, as the construction crews packed up for the day, Bennett noticed something odd. One of the workers had left a clipboard behind, propped against a stack of materials near the edge of the driveway. Curious, Bennett approached and flipped through the pages. Most of it was standard construction paperwork, but one section caught his eye: a list of instructions signed by Lynn herself. Among the notes was a line that made his blood run cold: "Ensure the project is completed ahead of schedule. Do not let the owner delay progress. Investor deadlines are non-negotiable." Investor deadlines? Bennett's heart sank as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just about his driveway or the council's overreach. Someone else was involved, someone with a vested interest in taking his land, no matter the cost. Bennett took a photo of the document before returning it to its place, his mind racing. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Whatever Lynn and her mysterious investors were planning, Bennett knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let them win. Bennett Grayson had long suspected that something larger was at play, but the phrase "investor deadlines" on the construction workers' clipboard confirmed it. This wasn't just a power grab by the neighborhood council. Someone with deep pockets and a specific agenda had their sights set on his property. Lynn Rawlings wasn't just overstepping her authority, she was a pawn in a far bigger game. Determined to uncover the truth, Bennett wasted no time. He forwarded the photo of the incriminating document to Rick Carlson, his lawyer, with a note: "We're dealing with more than the council here. This involves outside investors. We need to find out who." Rick responded within minutes, agreeing to dig into the council's recent financial records and activities. In the meantime, Bennett took his own steps. He hired a professional surveyor to conduct an updated analysis of his property boundaries. The surveyor, a meticulous older man named Gordon, spent the better part of a day walking the perimeter of Bennett's land, taking measurements and reviewing old maps. By late afternoon, Gordon confirmed what Bennett already knew: the driveway was entirely within his property lines, with no overlap onto so-called communal land. "This is airtight," Gordon said, handing Bennett the finalized survey report. "If they're claiming otherwise, they're lying." Armed with this new evidence, Bennett felt a renewed sense of confidence. But his relief was short-lived. That evening, as he reviewed Gordon's report, the rumble of engines outside once again pulled him to the window. To his disbelief, several vehicles were parked along his driveway, and a small crowd of people had gathered near the construction site. Folding chairs, coolers, and a makeshift podium had been set up, as if someone was hosting a public event on his property. Bennett stormed outside, his frustration boiling over. As he approached the crowd, he saw Lynn Rawlings at the center of it all, addressing the group with her usual air of authority. "This project represents progress for our community," she was saying, gesturing toward the workers and equipment. "It's an opportunity to enhance our neighborhood and create shared spaces for everyone to enjoy." "Get off my property," Bennett barked, cutting through her speech. The crowd turned to look at him, some appearing surprised, others simply curious. Lynn, however, remained unfazed. "Bennett," she said smoothly, "I was just explaining the importance of this project to the community. This is a public forum, and we're within our rights to hold it here." "This isn't a public forum," Bennett shot back. "This is my land, and if you don't leave, I'll have every single one of you removed for trespassing." Lynn's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Bennett, the council's decision to reclassify this driveway was legal and binding. You may not like it, but this space is now designated for community use." Bennett glared at her. "You and I both know that's not true. I've got the survey, the deed, and all the documentation to prove it. So unless you want the sheriff involved, I suggest you pack up your little show and leave." Lynn opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a tall man in a gray suit stepped forward from the crowd, He had a polished, professional demeanor, with sharp features and an unsettlingly calm expression. "Mr. Grayson," the man said, his voice smooth and measured, "I'm David Lennox, a consultant representing certain interests in this project. I understand your frustrations, but I assure you, this development is in the best interest of the community." "And what interests are those exactly?" Bennett demanded, narrowing his eyes. David gave a faint smile. "Let's just say there are parties who believe this property has potential beyond its current use. With the right adjustments, it could contribute significantly to the neighborhood's growth and prosperity." Bennett's stomach turned. He didn't need to read between the lines to understand what David meant. They didn't care about the driveway or the supposed community benefits. They wanted his land, plain and simple. "You mean you want to sell it to developers?" Bennett said bluntly. David didn't deny it. Instead, he clasped his hands in front of him and said, "There's an opportunity here, Mr. Grayson, one that benefits everyone. If you're open to discussion, I'm sure we can come to an arrangement that satisfies all parties." Bennett felt his anger rising again. "The only arrangement I'm interested in is you and your investors staying the hell off my property." David's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something colder in his eyes. "That's unfortunate," he said, "but I respect your position." With that, he stepped back into the crowd, leaving Lynn to deal with the fallout. She looked flustered, clearly unhappy with how things had played out. After a moment, she turned to the group and announced that the meeting was adjourned. The crowd dispersed slowly, some people casting curious glances at Bennett as they left. Lynn and David were the last to go, retreating to their vehicles without another word. As soon as they were gone, Bennett called Rick to update him. Rick listened carefully, then said, "This changes things. If there's an investor involved, they're probably using Lynn and the council as cover. We need to find out who they are and what they're after." "I've already got a name," Bennett said. "David Lennox. He said he's a consultant." Rick sighed. "Figures. I'll see what I can dig up on him. In the meantime, keep documenting everything. This isn't just about property rights anymore, it's about money, and that means they'll play dirty." Rick's words proved prophetic. Over the next few days, Bennett noticed a series of small but unsettling incidents. His mailbox was mysteriously knocked over one morning. A crew of workers arrived unannounced to inspect utility lines near his driveway, despite having no authorization. Even his trash cans were overturned, their contents scattered across the gravel. It was clear that someone was trying to rattle him, to make him feel like he was losing control. But Bennett refused to back down. He installed additional security cameras around his property, ensuring there were no blind spots. He also reached out to a local investigative journalist he knew, sharing the details of what was happening. The journalist, a sharp and relentless woman named Clara, was immediately intrigued. "This smells like a land grab," she said after hearing Bennett's story. "If they're targeting your property, they're probably doing it to others, too. Let me see what I can find." With Clara and Rick both working on the case, Bennett felt a glimmer of hope. But he knew the fight was far from over. Lynn, David, and whoever else was behind this wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted or until Bennett stopped them. One evening, as he reviewed footage from his security cameras, Bennett noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the early hours of the morning, a car had pulled onto his driveway and stopped near the construction site. Two figures emerged, one holding what looked like a large envelope. They walked up to the edge of his property, left the envelope on the ground, and drove off. Bennett grabbed a flashlight and went outside to retrieve it. The envelope contained a single document, a formal offer to purchase his property, signed by David Lennox. The sum was significant, far more than the market value of the land. Attached was a note that read, "Think it over. This can all end peacefully." Bennett crumpled the note in his fist, his resolve hardening. Peaceful wasn't an option. If they thought he could be bought, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. Bennett Grayson was no stranger to confrontation, but the stakes had never been this high. The formal offer left on his driveway wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration of war. David Lennox and whoever he was working with clearly believed they could wear him down through intimidation and money. They were mistaken. As Bennett crumpled the note and tossed it onto his desk, he decided he wouldn't let them steal what was his. The next morning, Bennett contacted Rick Carlson and updated him on the offer. Rick wasn't surprised. "They're trying to bait you into selling," he said. "It's a classic tactic. They escalate pressure and then dangle a lucrative payout, hoping you'll take it just to make them go away." "Well, they're wasting their time," Bennett growled. "But this means they're desperate. They know I won't back down. Desperation can make people dangerous," Rick warned. "We need to stay ahead of them." "I've been digging into Lennox, and it turns out he's not just a consultant. He's tied to a development firm that specializes in acquiring properties for luxury housing projects. They've been accused of using underhanded tactics before, but nothing's ever stuck." "So they're professionals," Bennett muttered. "Great, that's why we need to build an airtight case," Rick said. "I filed the injunction to halt any further construction on your driveway. It should buy us some time, but we'll need more than just property surveys to win this fight. I'm working on uncovering financial ties between Lennox, the council, and any developers involved. If we can prove collusion, we'll have a much stronger case." Bennett felt a flicker of hope but knew this was only the beginning. As Rick worked on the legal front, Bennett decided to take a closer look at the activity around his property. Over the past few days, he'd noticed an unusual number of vehicles passing by his house, some slowing down as if to inspect the driveway. It wasn't paranoia, someone was keeping tabs on him. That afternoon, as Bennett was inspecting the gravel damage caused by the construction crew, he noticed something strange, a small, black device half buried near the edge of the driveway. He picked it up, brushing off the dirt, and realized it was a wireless tracker. Bennett's stomach churned. Someone had planted this to monitor activity on his property. He immediately called Rick, who advised him to document the discovery and store the tracker as evidence. "This could be a violation of privacy laws," Rick said. "If they're resorting to surveillance, they're playing dirtier than we thought." Feeling the weight of the situation, Bennett decided to upgrade his security further. He contacted a local tech specialist and had motion detectors and additional cameras installed along the driveway and surrounding property. He also reinforced the gates at the entrance, adding locks that couldn't be easily tampered with. The next few days brought more signs of escalation. Bennett woke up one morning to find his trash bins overturned again, with garbage strewn across the driveway. On another occasion, he discovered deep tire tracks cutting through his front lawn, as if someone had deliberately driven across it during the night. Each incident was minor on its own, but together they painted a picture of calculated harassment. Then came the final straw. One evening, as Bennett sat on his porch watching the sunset, a dark SUV pulled up just outside his driveway. The tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside. The vehicle idled for several minutes before the passenger side window rolled down slightly, just enough for someone to toss out a small object before speeding away. Bennett rushed to the spot where the object landed and found a brick wrapped in paper. Unfolding the paper, he found a single message scrawled in bold black ink: "Last warning cell." His hands clenched around the note, anger surging through him. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to intimidate him, they were threatening him. The following morning, Bennett met with Rick in person to discuss the latest developments. Rick was alarmed but resolute. "We're filing a police report," he said firmly. "This goes beyond harassment. If they're making threats, we can involve law enforcement. It'll add weight to our case." Bennett agreed, though he doubted the police would be much help. He'd already dealt with their dismissive attitude when the council first started its construction efforts. Still, the more documentation he had, the better. Meanwhile, Rick had uncovered something that could turn the tide in their favor. "I've been digging through financial records," he explained. "It wasn't easy, but I found evidence that the council received a significant donation from a shell company tied to Lennox's development firm. The timing lines up perfectly with their decision to reclassify your driveway." "So they're being bribed," Bennett said, his suspicions confirmed. "It looks that way," Rick replied, "but we'll need more proof to make it stick. If we can connect the dots between Lennox, the council, and the development firm, we'll have a solid case for collusion and fraud." Bennett felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, he saw a clear path forward. The council and Lennox weren't as untouchable as they wanted him to believe. But just as he was beginning to feel some relief, the situation took another dark turn. That evening, as Bennett reviewed footage from his newly installed cameras, he noticed something alarming. At around 3 a.m., two figures in dark clothing had approached his property and tampered with the gate locks. They didn't gain entry but left something behind a spray-painted symbol on the gate that resembled an arrow pointing directly at his house. Bennett's blood ran cold. This wasn't just harassment, it was a warning. Whoever was behind this wanted him to know they could reach him anytime they wanted. The next morning, Bennett filed another police report, providing them with the footage and the tracker he'd found earlier. Though the officers were non-committal about taking action, Rick assured him that every report added to the growing case against the council and Lennox. Despite the mounting pressure, Bennett refused to back down. He met with a journalist named Clara, who had taken an interest in his story. Clara was known for her investigative work and had exposed several high-profile corruption cases in the past. After hearing Bennett's account, she promised to dig into Lennox's firm and its connection to the council. "This kind of land grab isn't new," Clara said. "They target people like you, independent property owners who don't have the resources to fight back. But if we can expose their tactics, we can stop them." With Clara's help, Bennett felt he finally had allies who could stand up to Lennox and the council. But he also knew the fight was far from over. The threats, the vandalism, and the surveillance were only going to escalate. Lennox and his backers wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted or until Bennett made them regret coming after him. As he sat on his porch that evening, staring at the spray-painted symbol on his gate, Bennett made a silent vow no matter how far they pushed, he wasn't going to let them win. Bennett Grayson stood at the edge of his driveway, staring at the freshly spray-painted symbol on his gate. It wasn't just an act of vandalism, it was a declaration of dominance, a message meant to break him. But instead of fear, Bennett felt a surge of defiance. He was done playing defense. It was time to take control of the situation and force the people behind this campaign into the light. The following morning, armed with every piece of evidence he had gathered, Bennett met with Rick Carlson and Clara, the investigative journalist. Rick had been working overtime to build their legal case, while Clara had uncovered a damning web of connections between David Lennox, the neighborhood council, and a shadowy development firm called Horizon Ventures. "They've done this before," Clara explained, laying out a series of documents on Rick's desk. Horizon Ventures specializes in acquiring small properties for redevelopment. They target neighborhoods like yours where independent landowners control key parcels of land. They use intimidation, council manipulation, and fake filings to force people into selling. Once they get the land, they flip it into high-end housing developments. Rick nodded, flipping through the documents. "And it looks like Lennox is their point man. He handles the dirty work, pressuring property owners and greasing the wheels with local councils." "They won't stop until they get what they want," Clara added. "But this time, they've made mistakes. There's a clear paper trail linking Horizon Ventures to the council's sudden decision to reclassify your driveway. And that donation? It's the smoking gun." Rick leaned back in his chair, his expression resolute. "We have enough to take this to court. I've already filed for a restraining order to stop any further construction or council actions on your property. Once the injunction is approved, we'll hit them with a fraud and collusion lawsuit." "That's not enough," Bennett said, his voice firm. "I want these people exposed. I want every single person who tried to take my land held accountable." Clara smiled. "That's where I come in. My team is preparing a full expose on Horizon Ventures, Lennox, and the council. Once we publish, there's no way they'll be able to hide." With the plan in motion, Bennett finally felt like he had the upper hand, but he also knew Lennox wouldn't go down without a fight. That night, his suspicions were confirmed. As Bennett reviewed his security footage, he noticed movement near the construction site. Two figures dressed in dark clothing were back. This time they were dismantling the cameras he had installed. Bennett grabbed his phone to call the police, but before he could, the power to his house suddenly cut out. The darkness was suffocating, but Bennett didn't panic. He grabbed a flashlight and his shotgun, his instincts from years of working in unpredictable environments kicking in. He moved quietly through the house, checking windows and doors. Outside, he could hear the faint crunch of gravel. Someone was approaching the house. Bennett flicked on the flashlight and stepped onto the porch, the beam slicing through the night. "Whoever's out there, you're trespassing," he called out. "Leave now, or I'll call the police." There was no response, just the rustle of leaves and the sound of retreating footsteps. After a tense few minutes, the property fell silent again. Bennett spent the rest of the night awake, keeping watch. The next morning, he found the full extent of the damage. The cameras were gone, the spray-painted symbol on his gate had been crossed out and replaced with the words "Final Warning," and several of his tools were missing from the shed. It was a clear escalation, a sign that Lennox's team was growing more desperate. Bennett reported the incident to the police, but as expected, they offered little help. Frustrated but undeterred, he focused on the upcoming court date. Rick had managed to secure a hearing to present their case for the restraining order, and Bennett knew it was his best chance to stop the council and Horizon Ventures in their tracks. On the day of the hearing, Bennett sat in the courtroom alongside Rick and Clara, watching as Lynn Rawlings and David Lennox entered with their legal team. Lynn looked rattled, but Lennox was as calm and composed as ever. His confidence only made Bennett more determined to take him down. Rick presented their case with precision, laying out the forged filings, the fraudulent reclassification of the driveway, and the financial ties between Horizon Ventures and the council. Clara's research provided additional weight, with evidence of similar schemes in other neighborhoods. Lennox's lawyer tried to dismiss the accusations as baseless, arguing that the reclassification was perfectly legal, and that any concerns about harassment were unsubstantiated. But Rick was ready. He presented photos, video footage, and sworn statements from witnesses, painting a damning picture of corruption and collusion. When the judge finally spoke, the tension in the room was palpable, based on the evidence presented. She said, "It is clear that the actions of the council and associated parties were not only improper but likely illegal. The restraining order is granted, and all construction activities on Mr. Grayson's property are to cease immediately. Furthermore, this court recommends a formal investigation into the council's practices and financial dealings." Lynn's face went pale, and for the first time, Bennett saw a crack in Lennox's composure. It wasn't a total victory, there was still a long legal battle ahead, but it was a decisive blow against their plans. As Bennett left the courtroom, Clara caught up with him. "This is just the beginning," she said. "Once the investigation starts, the whole house of cards will collapse. People like Lennox rely on staying in the shadows, but now everyone will see them for what they are." Bennett nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. He had stood his ground, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like he had regained control. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned in his favor. And he wasn't about to let up until every single person who had tried to take his land paid the price. Bennett Grayson stood on his porch, watching as the last of the construction equipment was loaded onto trucks and driven off his property. The restraining order had worked, and the council, along with David Lennox, had no choice but to halt all activity on his driveway. For the first time in weeks, Bennett's land was quiet again, untouched by their meddling. The court's ruling had sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. News of the investigation into the council's financial dealings spread quickly, and Lynn Rawlings became a pariah overnight. Neighbors who once viewed her as a symbol of leadership turned against her, demanding her resignation. Within days, she stepped down, her polished facade shattered under the weight of public scrutiny. David Lennox, however, remained elusive. Horizon Ventures distanced itself from the controversy, claiming Lennox had acted independently. It was a strategic move, one that kept the company's name out of the immediate headlines, but Bennett knew the truth. Clara's expose had detailed the full extent of Horizon's tactics, connecting the dots between their shadowy acquisitions and Lennox's orchestrated harassment campaigns. As the weeks passed, the fallout continued to grow. The council faced multiple lawsuits from other residents, emboldened by Bennett's success. Developers who had been circling the neighborhood like vultures suddenly disappeared, unwilling to risk further exposure. What began as a fight over a driveway had turned into a reckoning for an entire system built on greed and manipulation. Despite the victory, Bennett knew the damage couldn't be undone entirely. His driveway, though still intact, bore scars from the relentless construction. His sense of peace had been shaken, replaced by a lingering awareness of how easily those with power could upend someone's life. Determined to reclaim his home and his stability, Bennett got to work. He repaired the damage to his driveway himself, pouring his frustration into every stroke of the trowel and every laid brick. He reinforced his property's boundaries, adding new gates and a security system that ensured no one could cross onto his land without his permission. One afternoon, as he was finishing the final touches on the driveway, Clara stopped by. She handed him a printed copy of her expose. The headline, bold and unapologetic land grab, exposed how corruption threatened an American homeowner. Bennett flipped through the pages, taking in the damning evidence against Lennox, the council, and Horizon Ventures. "It's over," Clara said, leaning against her car. "They won't come after you again. Not after this." Bennett nodded, though a part of him remained cautious. "I just want them to stay away for good." "They will," Clara assured him. "Your fight made sure of that." As Clara left, Bennett stood for a moment, holding the newspaper and looking out over his property. The fight had taken a toll, but it had also taught him something invaluable. He had faced intimidation, manipulation, and outright threats, yet he hadn't backed down. He had protected what was his, not just for himself but for everyone else who might have been targeted next. That evening, Bennett hosted a small gathering for the neighbors who had supported him. It wasn't the kind of thing he normally did, but it felt right. Together they shared stories, food, and a renewed sense of community, united by the lessons learned from the ordeal. As the sun set, Bennett sat on his porch, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The driveway, once a battleground, now stood as a testament to his resilience. He had fought for his home and won, proving that even against powerful adversaries, the strength of one determined person could make all the difference.